short story panel. And the long and short of it is we have two men and two women. And we're going to talk about the short story and how it's evolved over time and what it means for us as writers writing today. To kick things off, I'm going to ask the panelists to read a bit from their works. Chika's book just came out 4 days ago. So if you're here today, consider this the launch of Chika's new book and try and get a copy. She's promised me some ice cream, so I'm plugging it. Jennifer, I met 6 years ago, online before I saw her. She trounced out so badly at the Kwani Manuscript Prize with Chintu. And then she just released Manchester Happened, which is a lovely collection of short stories. Chika is my mother-in-law. Her son, my in-law, yeah. Her son is marrying my daughter. So this is an official invitation to the wedding, yeah. It's coming very soon. Billy, I don't know very well, because each time I've met him, I've either been drunk or he's been drunk. But I know we've met a few times since 2009 or so. So we're always in the zone, and we define the zone in a while. So I'll ask Billy to read first. I don't believe in patriarchy. I believe in equality. So, gentlemen first.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks so much for being here. It's just so incredible being here. I've wanted to come to work here for a very, very long time. I had the opportunity to come in 2015, and I never made it because we were running what was the last Kwani Literary Festival. But it's really, really amazing being here. So I'm going to read from the title story, and it's called The Cape Cod Bicycle War. We came to Orleans, Cape Cod, that winter after 9/11 to work at the local Wendy's stores from Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Africa, new to America, and dorming at the Wendy's house. Juanita Gomez and Camela Dos Santos from Bogota moved into the house, and because they were there first, took over the TV. Then Juanita made the green Schwinn with the large tires and low slung seat hers. Camela chose the red chopper with a tall front, handlebars, and front small wheel. Kudzai Farai, a Shona boy who had already been around a year before in some sort of self-exile from Zimbabwe, kept the large mountain Schwinn. Joao da Silva from Sao Paulo chose a large traditional bicycle, heavy as a farmhorse, that George Moldavano from Moldavia called a Soviet worker's bicycle. Jojo rode a large black Trojan, the newest bike in the house. John Biko Kamau from Kenya and Brazilian Roberto Perez were left without bicycles because they had come to Orleans last. At first, Joao shared his bike with Roberto. Kudzai and Camela let John Biko use their bikes whenever he wanted. The bikes were not a problem before it became cold. In the final weeks of autumn, the girls preferred to walk anyway, so there's always a free bike. But we were 8, and there were only 6 working bicycles, and winter was coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. Chika.
Thank you all for being here. So I'm just going to read from the first short story in the collection. It's called The Transfiguration of Rapo. The new man was tall and lanky, his stomach not spilling over his trousers like those of the other men who gathered at Prosperous and Agos. Yet, despite that, he moved in such a way that put Prosperous in mind of an overfed, pampered cat. He had a fashionable haircut and a thin strip of bird in the middle of his chin. This was a man for whom life in Europe had not been hard. Prosperous envied him that, a life untouched still by hardness, soft like a baby's buttocks, like the life she had lived before. My beautiful wife, Rapo. A small woman suddenly appeared from behind him. She sat down on the edge of the sofa as if she were ready to flee at the slightest sound. When Prosperous asked if she wanted a drink, she nodded but did not specify what, not even when Prosperous asked, mineral or juice? She held the glass of juice Prosperous gave her with both hands, as if holding it down to keep it from flying away. She was new, but not in the same way the man, Gwachi, was. She was new to Europe. He was just new to Belgium and to the group that met regularly at Agos to drink and talk, dissecting their lives and sharing their nostalgia for a country they swore they could not wait to live in again. Once the money was made and they could retire and live in the mansions they were going to build in Lagos, Abuja, Enugu, Onitsha, Jos, whichever city in Nigeria their deferred lives still inhabited. The new man had moved to Germany a few months ago. Agu told Prosperous the first time Gwachi visited with his paper wife, his German wife, Hilda. He said Germany is very hard for black men, harder than Belgium. Can you imagine? Hilda suggested the move to Turnhout when he said he had heard this place was easier for blacks. She gave up her life in Germany for him, Oyibo women and love. They'll give up everything for the person they love, Agu said. Prosperous did not remind him that there was a time when he would have given up everything for her, and she would have done the same for him, did do the same for him. Prosperous said instead, we've all given up things. The wife Gwachi had with him now, and whom he brought most times he came afterwards, and with whom he had a 6-year-old back in Nigeria, was Igbo, like everyone else in the flat. Rapo did not live with him. She lived with a Nigerian man called Shylock. Nobody seemed to know what his real name was. He'd earned his nickname for the exorbitant fees he charged for whatever service he provided, even to his fellow Igbo. Shylock drove an Audi, had a gold tooth, and always wore a beret and dark Ray-Bans. In the winter, he wore a long black leather jacket with a furry trim on the hood. At Christmas, he threw lavish parties where the signature dish was chicken Shylock, a succulent affair that exploded in a multitude of flavors in the mouth, sour and sweet, spicy and soothing mint. No matter how much anyone begged for the recipe, he refused to give up its secret. It was said that Shylock threw even bigger parties in his village at Easter, where he gave out bags of rice and tins of palm oil to widows. Gwachi complained that Shylock was charging him too much, 20,000 euros, and we're from the same village. The man is my Borapo. He lost money too much. When am I going to pay all that off? You make it sound like you're paying off a car, Prosperous said, irritated. Well, Shylock is expensive, but he never dips into a pot of soup that's not his, Agu said. You remember the story about that Ogwashi man? What happened to the Ogwashi man, Rapo asked. The Ogwashi man had been paid a huge amount to marry a certain Ogwashi woman whose husband was already in the country, but who could not bring her in because he was legally married to a Belgian woman. The man, very much like Gwachi, missed his real wife so much he did not want to wait until he had got his papers and divorced his white wife to bring her in himself. But the Ogwashi man not only took the money, he also took the wife, even going back to Ogwashi to pay her dowry once the husband in Belgium had had his dowry returned. Thank you.
I enjoyed Chika's book, but when she mentioned Ogwashi, I got upset because that's where my mom is from. And she was yabbing us Jennifer, please.
Morning, everybody. Morning, everyone. Thanks for waking up very early in the morning to be here with us. Someone had put up his hand? Okay. I'm going to read from the very first short story. It's about a 14-year-old boy who's having major problems with his parents, and actually he just wants to leave Manchester and go back to Uganda. So a month ago, Luzinda had told his mother that he did not want a birthday party that year. She had dismissed him with nonsense. What child does not want a birthday party? He had appealed to his dad, but his dad was useless. Talk to your mother is all he ever says. So Luzinda had always suspected that his birthday parties were as much for his parents as they were for him. And yesterday, when his mother ignored his wishes, confirmed this. How do you explain the amount of beer and wine she bought? And you know how on the way back from a party, your parents start digging into their so-called friends? So-and-so is getting deported. Oh, and so-and-so has bought a Mercedes, yet lives like a rat. Oh, they are on benefits. And so has married for the visa. Oh, so-and-so's children have turned into British brats. That daughter's there must be a lesbian. Did you see her haircut? And so are the same clan and same totem, but cohabiting, spit. So Luzinda had been certain that after the party, on their way home, guests would sink their talons into his parents. So yesterday when the guests started to arrive, he locked himself in the bathroom. Asking where the birthday boy was, uncle after uncle, then auntie after auntie stood outside the bathroom door, cajoling him to come out and open his presents, but Luzinda remained mute. Then Nalong sighed. Children brought up in Bungereza, they are impossible. And Auntie Puna was quick to justify herself. That's why I left mine behind. I can't manage. As if children brought up in Africa were perfect. As if grown-ups who grew up in Uganda weren't liars, and still Nalong had whispered, something is wrong somewhere in this house. That had made Luzinda sit up. He should not have locked himself in the store. Too late, the guests were now going to tear into his parents' bag anyway.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask about 3 questions, which everybody will just take turns answering. Then I'll ask a few more specific questions to the books. So the first one is that storytelling is as old as the beginning, right? Is what hunters did after they came back from the hunt. And now today, for me, I think the short story approximates to the oral tradition the most, because the novel is actually, a artificial construct, if you will. So, what does short story mean to you as an African writer, Jennifer? Okay. Gentleman first.
This collection comes from, I wrote it over a long period of time. So it's mostly about stuff that just comes to me naturally. And the most practical thing was the publishing of it. But I always felt story, like, it's interesting you say that the hunters came in. I wish I had met those hunters, whoever they were. But I'll always remember this, like, if you've been to Nairobi, and if you go to African cities, there are always these places young people hang out. And
they're called bars.
Even before bars. So there are these they don't have the release of bars. So in Kenya, they're called base. And this is you take it for granted, but this is, I think, an incredible place for stories. Before anyone realizes, everyone is frustrated and they want to kind of move on and take off. And for me, that's where, and I don't think I actually achieved that with this collection, simply because the short story is demanding, as you said. It's quite a tough form, right? Yeah, but this idea of where the short story comes from, the idea of tightness, the idea of compactness, the idea of, that's where most of these stories come from.
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting that Toni would appropriate or revise history and appropriate short story form in oral literature to hunters, because we all know that it's women who tell you. Yeah, I mean, in our cultures,
Thank you, sister.
yeah, So you just hear revising history anyhow, with impudence. Anyway, but and so the short story form in oral, because in Igbo oral literature, there were forms that were endemic to men. Well, maybe endemic isn't the term, like proverbs, right? So proverbs are or were, men's domain. But the short story form was primarily the women's domain, because stories were also meant to educate, right? And the primary caregivers were mothers. And so they would gather the children and they would tell them stories, teaching them not just history, but also passing on lessons to them. Now, what was your question?
What does this form of writing, which was invented by African women, what does it mean to you as a contemporary African writer, and how do you approach it?
I mean, we all tell stories, right? I think it's the most natural form to come to human beings, right? I remember growing up, and my mother, I like to say my mother was actually my first teacher of writing. So if my mother had a guest while she was away, right, and she came back and you told her, Mrs. Okafor came to visit you, she'll tell you, so when did she come? You had to be precise. My mother does not like vague answers. What was she wearing? Okay, so what did you tell her? I told her you went home. So when you told her I wasn't home, what did she say? Well, she said she would come back. But what was her tone of voice like? So we used to dodge having to be the ones to give my mother news of visitors who had come, because you had to know, you had to tell us what their tone of, you had to tell her what their tone of voice was, what they looked like, how their face was. If you said, oh, they just looked surprised. Yeah, but did they look surprised with their mouths open, or did they just look with their eyes wide open? So you had to really observe. So my mother taught me to observe, right? And I think that every day we tell, whether you're just sitting down and, chatting with friends, you're telling stories, right? And how do I approach it? Well, I eavesdrop a lot, right? So I've written stories just from hearing one part of the conversation. And I think it's so interesting, you're eavesdropping, especially airports, a lovely place to eavesdrop. People are talking and you're like, oh, wow, I wonder what's going on. So it's fun to sort of make up the other side of the conversation. And it's fun to make up what you haven't heard and to fill that up, right? And I think that as human beings, we are conditioned to lie, right? So, nobody's 100% honest. We lie out of kindness, we lie out of cruelty, we lie because, we want to get out of, whatever. Someone asks you, do I look good? Unless you're a really mean person, you don't say, no, you don't. You actually, your hair is crazy and your shoes are crazy. Nobody likes a brutally honest person. And so we've also sort of learned to navigate, right? And it's in that navigating that you sort of train yourself to write fiction. Have I answered your question? Okay. Oh, okay.
I've totally forgotten the question.
Okay, so the form, right? I think that it approximates most the oral traditional format of storytelling. So now, as a contemporary African writer, how do you approach the form, and what does it mean to you, as a writer?
Okay, when it comes to oral traditional stories, I know of the folk tale, because that's the closest to to the short story. And often the folktale, we have the animal stories, you know, small animals outwitting the big ones. And of course, we have the folktale, which is about the girl, the pretty girl who would not marry anybody.
There is a ghost.
Yes. You know, oh, there's a horrible stepmother. So, in a way, most of the stories that we know, the oral stories, have lived hundreds of years. And therefore, that means that there must have been a lot of stories, but they did not survive time and test. So when I look at my short story, I find it very difficult to compare it to the oral traditional stories, because those are really complex and tight, and they've been worked over time after time, you know, rather than mine, which is only been told by me. But I hope that because the short story is easily accessible and easily digestible, and it's one of those that take a moment and build it up. I hope that perhaps it will survive a little longer, and it will be respected a little bit more in Africa than it is elsewhere, because of the oral tradition that it comes from. But my approach to it, and again, this explains perhaps why I find it incredibly difficult. I was so happy to hear Billy say it is a difficult form. For me, I came to the short story when I was writing Chinto. And someone said to me, you know what? If you want to understand the nature of storytelling, do write some short stories, because with Chinto it's so big, you might get lost in the middle. And I'm telling you, I finished Chinto before I finished the first short story that I was working on. It took me 4 years to get it right, okay? This is how hard it is. So for me, my approach is always take a snapshot or a picture out of life, and then work on it, or work on that. So most of the stories in the short, in my collection, are from a life I've kind of lived, okay? But that life is very close to me. I'm not yet objective. I'm not standing far away from it enough, because I'm still living in a migration kind of life. So I just take a moment and focus on it and leave it. And then pick out another moment and focus on it and leave it. It's not the way I handled Chinto, which is 1,700 years away from me, where I could be objective. So, and I don't think the way I handle the short story is the way everybody else does, but that's my approach.
But I think that the short story form, certainly demands that sort of discipline, right? I tell my students, you have to imagine that you're paying for every single word, right? So just imagine you're paying $2 for every word. And you're
That's
paying,
actually how it happened back in the day.
Really, I said, then I tell them, imagine that you're paying for every character. So who are you not willing to pay for?
Yeah.
So it demands a lot. It demands a lot of discipline and a lot of persistence. The oldest short story in this collection was written, I want to say in 1999. And then I just sort of kept revising it, and it's gone through various forms, published in various different forms, and it's only the one in this collection that I'm really, really happy with the form that it's sort of arrived at, so.
It's funny how you guys talk about how difficult it is to write. Because it kind of speaks to the title of our panel, the long of the short story.
Yeah.
So it might be short, but it doesn't get written in a
Of course, because it doesn't give you the space to play around like a novel would. You have to get in and you have to run off with it, right? And getting and running off with it takes years. Some people it might be a few days, but it certainly takes a long time to do for me.
So looking at African writing, so we had the novels, then, because of the military, whatever, we had so many poems. But suddenly now we're doing short stories. And even though people say the short story is difficult to write, it's difficult to sell, but I think that the Kane Prize has made it such a powerful and popular genre, right? So what do you guys think? Do you think, do you think that the short story is getting easier to write, to sell and getting more popular, or do you think the novel is still king?
I'm going to talk about it in terms of regions. Okay. In Europe, they are still snobbish about the short story. You know, it's very hard to get a publisher who will invest their money into your collection of short stories. Now, the US is more respecting, but not yet there as to the novel. They would expect you to write your first book as a novelist, a short story. They'll forgive you. But if you keep on writing short stories, you're expected to move on.
To grow up.
To grow, I know, to the novel. And in Britain, they've been very, very snobbish. So my publisher had never published short stories. So they were happy to publish Chintu. But when I told them that the book I'm working on is short stories, they went absolutely silent. But what happened was that I gave my third book to my agent. And my agent cleverly sent them the novel and said, you know, her novel is available, but if you want it, you better check the short story. So that's how I managed to get it published. So, but here in Africa, because of the awards for the short stories, people are being conditioned to read the short stories. And in Africa, life is too busy. And people read off their phones. A short story is very easy to read off the phone or off a Kindle than a full novel. So I think this is why it's working better here. And I heard my publisher now saying that I've been going around the Guardian and the Times and asking, you need to reinstate the awards for the short story, meaning that if there are more awards for the short stories, people would be buying, because people love reading stories written by winners.
That's true. Chika.
Huh?
The short story.
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Okay, so I said, has the King Prize made it more?
Yes,
popular?
Certainly, especially around here. The King Prize has been instrumental in really propelling the
What's your experience selling it to?
Propelling the short story to the forefront. And I think the Guardian does other times, they have the short story award, which is like, say, £30,000 or something, or £50,000.
That's a single short story.
But not for collections.
For the collection.
So in the UK and in the US, it's still, like Jennifer said, still incredibly difficult to sell short story collections, even though there have been successful short story writers, Alice Munro, Laurie Moore, even Leslie, these are people who write primarily short stories, right? And there's just this fallacy that readers don't want to pay for short stories. They feel like it's a waste of money. They'd rather pay for, a novel, rather pay for a big novel and know that their money is invested wisely. Which is kind of, it's silly, right? But I think eventually maybe, depending on would swing, the other way. And which is why I think what BB is doing with Cassava Republic Shorts is incredible, right? Just devoting, a whole year, a whole publishing year to just short stories, which is incredible, because short stories are not the Cinderella stepsister to novels. They take us much time, they take us more determination, they take us much grit and blood and sweat to write, as the novel does. I don't think I suffered less writing the short story than I did writing my novels.
I suffered more.
Precisely, right? It's because you don't have the space to play.
So Billy?
I think the short story is like the writers. It's the writer's form. I think everything else is the reader's. That's how I approach it. So this is a place you go and try to become really good. It is a writer's form for me. You try and make your plots quicker, you try and make your characters quicker, snappier, you try and make, it's a very, very technical thing. But the beauty about it is, if you get it right, it's also very rewarding. And I don't think anyone, apart from, like, really, people who really read, like, short stories in the way they read the novel, read it anything else apart from technical pleasure. Yeah, that's the weird thing about
I think it was James Joyce who said that the feeling you get from reading a short story is like an epiphany, like, oh, that happened, you know. I mean, with a novel, it happens a series of times, so then it just wears out. But with a short story, a good one, it really hits you. So your book is Cape Cod, Bicycle War, Better Never Than Late, then Manchester Happened. There's a streak, right? Which is immigration, bits and pieces of it in yours, and then there's trauma, right? So the trauma of the newly arrived African in a foreign clime. So I'm going to ask, on a scale of 1 to 100, right? How...
That's a wide scale. Go on.
So how neurotic is the immigrant experience, you know, by your own reckoning, on a scale of 1 to 100? And can you give me examples?
I haven't understood that question.
So there's neurosis, right? You arrive in a new place and you can't adjust, you can't.
Yeah.
So on a scale of 1 to 100, having lived abroad and written this book, how much do you think an immigrant suffers when they arrive in this different place? Yeah.
Okay. I think we are all different. Yeah. The way we migrate is not similar. One of the things that I've discovered is that women migrate, African women migrate better than African men. And you know why? Because we are used to being oppressed. Yeah. It's because we are used to being second citizens. So when we go to Britain or America and white people and all the people we find there treat us like whatever, we're like, okay, move on. Meanwhile, men, I'm a man. Yes, I am a man. And that's my chair. And hell no. The British or the Americans have no idea what you're talking about, and you're just an African. Okay? And this is why in the UK, when you go to mental hospitals, it's mainly black men, because they are put in a position they have not occupied, and they find it very hard to adjust. So, but even within that, it depends on your, so if you were a prime minister in Nigeria, and you're thrown out of power, and you go to Britain and you get a job as a security officer, you suffer more, okay? If you were a house girl in Nigeria and you go to Britain and you were a house girl, you're like, hallelujah. Bring
promotion,
it.
yeah.
You know, so we're all different. The middle classes, if you've grown up here and you're middle class, we suffer a little bit because, you know, I'm supposed to be teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, and whatever. And then you get there and they're like, yeah, try the nursing home. So again, you know, so I can't give you a specific range of pain because we all immigrate differently.
That works. Thank you. Chika?
Yeah, I mean, like Jennifer said, you can't really rate pain, right? Pain isn't something that you can rate from a 0 to 100. People experience pain and loss and loneliness differently. And in my personal experience, so I moved to Belgium after college because I met a guy, loved him, he moved, I moved with him, you know. So I felt like I was really, really ready to move. You know, I was moving for love, right? And then I get thrown into this space where nothing I knew mattered, right? So it didn't matter that I had a university degree.
Yeah.
It didn't matter that I spoke English because I didn't speak Dutch, and I didn't speak French, and I didn't speak German. I didn't speak any of the 3 national languages of Belgium, so my English meant nothing. it didn't matter that, I was this confident young girl. I had to really start from scratch, and that was super difficult for me to do. So at the beginning, we lived with my parents-in-law, and my parents-in-law are super structured. So I remember the first morning, like nothing I knew mattered before, not etiquette, nothing, right? And so the first morning, my husband calls me down for breakfast, and I'm like, maybe I don't want to eat yet. He said, oh, but my parents are at the table. And I'm like, so? Like, let them eat now. When I'm ready, I'll come down. And he's like, no, you need to come down. I said, okay, but I haven't had a bath. He said, no, that's fine. You can bath after. I'm like, no, I can't. I need to bath first and look presentable. He's like, no, no, no. And then I remember, we get through that, and I'm sitting at the table with these people, and they're like, oh, what would you like to drink? And I'm like, oh, hot chocolate. They're looking at me like, but you're a grown woman, hot chocolate. I'm like, And then I remember having malaria the first week, right? And my mother-in-law comes to, you have malaria at home and they pet you and they give you everything you want to eat. Mother-in-law is like, if she's not hungry, it's fine. And I was like, wow, And then,
I'm dying.
She's like, no, if you're not hungry, it's fine, And I think at some point I asked my husband if he could make rice for me, rice and stew or something. And he, his mother had asked, is there anything that she would want to eat at some point? I think she was feeling guilty. And my husband said, rice and stew. And she's like, what stew? My husband said, oh, it's some tomato sauce. And she gives me this rice soaked in water, and there's cheese in it. And then there's this host one, like, okay, you've entered. You've entered trouble. But yeah, you've entered one chance. But and then you get beyond that. So my first year in Belgium, I suffered from panic attacks, right? Because I couldn't even go out and buy bread on my own. It was a humbling experience, but it was also a very traumatic experience for me. So I suffered panic attacks. My husband would go to work, and I would lie in bed all day. And just before he came back, I would dress up. And he'd be like, oh, did you go out? I'd be like, yeah, I walked around, But I hadn't gone anywhere, right? So, and then, so it took me to learn the language, to sort of gain the self-confidence I had before, to sort of start finding sanity again. Yeah. And then you hear stories of, women who, there's a story, one of my friends told me about the mother who came in from the Congo. So she spoke French, they were in Brussels, yeah. So hers wasn't the language issue. Yeah. Hers was just being thrown in this place where everything was new. And the woman did not talk. She didn't talk for a while, yeah. Until they sent her back to the Congo, right? And so they're all sort of there's always a loneliness, a certain sense of loneliness that comes with living what you know. And it doesn't matter how you migrate, it happens to everybody, right? But I also think it's interesting what Jennifer said about women adjusting better, right? And it's absolutely true. The men in my book don't want to clean. They're like, no, I can't clean. Cleaning is for women. So I'll do anything rather than clean, right? And so in Belgium, they're in abattoirs, and these are people who have degrees in architecture, and the thing with Belgium is that you can't even drive a bus. I remember the first black bus driver we had in the city I lived in was a Kenyan woman. And oh my goodness, it was such a big deal. She was like a celebrity, right? God. Because to drive a bus, you have to speak Dutch. To be a conductor on the train, you have to know Dutch, German, French, because you're interacting with people, right? And English as well, because you're interacting with people. I have a friend who moved years before I did, right? And there's this thing about the immigrant communities, right? So you move, you look for people like you, that's always the first step. And somehow the narrative that goes around there determines what you do, right? And so there was a girl I met who eventually became a really good friend of mine. And she moved years before I did, right? She married a footballer, right? And so her husband had, he moved as a professional, right? So he was playing football. But she had an engineering degree from Nigeria. So when she came in, she wanted a job. And they told her, well, you don't speak French, you don't speak Dutch, you don't speak whatever else. You can't really get a job as an engineer. And then the other footballers' wives are telling her, well, here, African women just clean, we don't do any of those things. And so she started looking she worked in a factory for many, many years. So she had been working in a factory by the time I met her, right? And when I met her, somebody had told her that there was a new Nigerian in town. and that the girl said she was going to be a writer. And she said, that she laughed. She said, see this one. She doesn't know. She wants to be a writer here. She had better come and join us at the factory, right? Or cleaning with us. And she told me this. And then when I started my PhD, she was like, wow, you're really doing it. So she quit her factory job. And she went back to school to get a business degree.
Prosperous, yeah.
Right? Yeah. And she went back to get a business degree, right? And then the year I got my PhD, she was on to her second MBA, right? But then she still couldn't get a job. And then she moved to the UK. And then she took a teacher training course and started teaching mathematics. But then she had family in Belgium, so she couldn't really stay there. It was sort of getting difficult. She worked for like 4 years as a mathematics teacher in England. Her husband didn't want to move because he was very comfortable in Belgium. And eventually she had to move back after like 4 or 5 years of teaching to Belgium, right? And now, even getting a job as a cashier's assistant, she's not qualified for it. And she went back to take a 4-week course to work as a cashier's assistant, right? Or she can't. So she's back to cleaning, right?
Okay.
All right, so we have just 10 minutes.
I'm sorry.
But I'm going to ask specific questions now, right? Billy, just 2 minutes. You told me years ago that in Kenya, for two guys to be friends, they would have dragged each other out of the gutter after a night of drinking. And that place where you fall into the gutter is called the zone. Can you define the zone for us, for those of us who are children in Nigeria, in this art?
Thanks. I just found what the previous conversation about this idea of women making it. This is quite true, actually, even in Africa. So my sisters are definitely more successful than I am, and this is a thing. This is a thing I try and figure out. Why is it that African men of a certain generation, at least Kenyan men, at least Nairobi young men, are unable to deal with what there is there to deal with? This is, for me, a completely fascinating conversation. And it segues into that thing. My generation of, I think, young African men are just spoiled. These are the after effects of patriarchy, or what we call patriarchy, where you're told that you're special, that you're told that everything will come to you. You're just spoiled. I think that's all it comes down to. And for me, my collection is also about that. It's really about when you realize you're spoiled and you've been promised things that are not coming to you, how do you deal? And that is, some people lie in the gutter, many die. Then some people, or some young men, Africans, Nairobians, wake up and like, hey, fuck, I've got to get my shit together. And that's that.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so Jennifer, your book is filled with traumatic stories, right? Very sad stories. But it's one of the funniest books I've read in a very long while. How did you manage that balance? Is it for us to laugh, to stop from crying, or something?
In a way, I think I look back and I think it's two reasons. One is that I grew up at a time in Uganda when there was a lot of pain. So I was a child during Idi Amin's time, and I was a teenager during the wars. And how we coped with the pain was through laughter. So somebody would come home and say, I was in front of a guy and he was shot. And I said, I'm not dying tonight. I am not dying tonight. He's telling it with laughter, And he then gone to demonstrate how comically he jumped and dodged bullets like you can. And by the end of the story, you're all laughing, but some people actually died. And for a very long time, our theater was like that. People wrote plays, and they were tragic. They're about AIDS, they're about war, they're about death, but it's always told with laughter. So there's that. But also, I was lucky that I studied literature from a very early age, up to the PhD level. And one of the things that I was aware of is that if you're going to take a reader down there, really down there, you better give them relief. So actually it's called comic relief. So I'm always aware, because when I'm writing, I am also going there, you know, and I need to be pulled up myself, you know. Or sometimes, for example, the story of the dog. When I was writing it, I was absolutely in laughter, you know. And again, I was told that the way you feel when you're writing your story, now is the way the readers are going to.
So, Chika, I've known you for a long time, and I won't call you a firebrand feminist, right? But this book looks like a feminist manifesto. Can you just speak to that? Was it intentional, and what were you thinking? I mean, writing this stories?
I don't know what you mean by you wouldn't call me a firebrand feminist. What's a firebrand feminist? You make it sound like a bad thing, which it isn't.
Yeah,
You
a
shouldn't be
firebrand
scared.
feminist.
Don't dig any further. I'm giving you a way out.
I've never heard
right?
the word firebrand used.
You just did.
No, because I mean, you know, this thing, he was digging, right?
He is just provoking you.
But anyway, so I like characters with agency, right? And readers also enjoy characters with agency. And so the women in my short stories have agency. I think that's just it. That's the short answer, right?
Have you ever heard the word firebrand used in a positive light?
No, well, you know, I'm trying to forgive him.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take 2 questions from the audience.
I just finished reading Kintu, and my question is still, is Shintu, sorry, I'm in Nigeria.
It's lovely to hear Nigerians correcting Nigerians.
Okay, Shintu, okay. Did you set out to debunk myths about Idi Amin? Because we believe they did a lot of bad things. We saw movies where he was eating human being, he had eggs in his fridge and all of that. Did you set out to debunk myths about Idi Amin?
In a way, yes, I did. And now, before I answer that question, let me put this out. That Idi Amin, one of his men, abducted my dad. And my dad was brutalized. And he lost his mind after that. We never had him again. So I just want to put it out there that I'm not pro-Idi Amin. Just cannot be. However, when I arrived in Britain, and people were saying Idi Amin was a cannibal, suddenly I became a cannibal. You know, he is my monster, okay? He was Ugandan. When white people start saying certain things that I know did not happen, I feel complicit, okay? So in a way, I decided, and there's this problem with Europe. When somebody is bad, they refuse to see the good side. There were certain good things that Idi Amin did, believe it or not. So for example, when during colonial time, Muslims could not go to Christian schools because they were Muslims. But when Idi Amin came into power, he realized Muslims were far behind Christians. And he decided, you know what? The weekend is going to be divided into 2. Friday will be a weekend so that my Muslims can go and pray, and Saturday will be a school day. So my Muslim can go to school, and then Sunday you Christians can do whatever you want to do. He built a lot of Muslim schools. He built a university, which I went to. This is why now Muslims and Christians were at par in terms of education. But you don't know that. But when I was in Britain and everything, because by then I was realizing that the way they look at Africans, like we are a very different species of humanity. And so everything that they were saying about Idi Amin, they were saying about me. And I said, hang on a minute. Let me put it out there that, you know what? He did A, B, C, D. Next time when I come back, I'll talk about other things.
My name is Aunli, and I am in publishing. And I've always been very curious about the short story. Two things which I would like to get everybody's take on is the short story, like Billy said, is a technical form. Personally, I always discourage new writers not to undertake the short story as a first work to approach, because I think it's, like he said, technical. But what I want to ask from the three of you is, I have a belief that because the novel is not easy, but it's easier than the short story to approach, I've always believed that the short story is a stopgap to the in-betweens in between when you finish the novel. Unlike Chika said when she was speaking that many of her stories have been published in various forms and the rest of it. So what I want to know is it a stopgap for you, or do you regard the genre as something that you just like an original, to produce original work? Like it's
So are you saying, is it a full meal or a snack?
And that's nicely put,
Okay.
yeah. So would you regard it, what is your personal opinion? Would you regard it as an original, would you regard it that your work, you want it to be an original work, or do you regard it as a stopgap? I always think it's a stopgap, that writers go to short stories when the novel is probably giving them difficulty, or the novel is, so what is your own impression about, your own take about the short story?
It's certainly a full meal. It's just a different genre, right? And I don't know that one is easier or more difficult for me. They just have different demands of you, right? So in a novel, you've got wide expanse of things to play with. So you can play with language, you've got more characters, you've got more time in terms of, time as setting, it's a lot more difficult to write a short story set over 100 years, for example, just because you're going to have to cram in a lot of stuff. Short stories are better when they're just like a snapshot, of life, a day, whatever, then they work better. So yeah, it's certainly a full meal. It's not a stopgap. I actually started off writing short stories before writing novels. And while I'm writing novels, I'm writing short stories. One isn't, if I take a break, it's because if I take a break to write something else, it's because maybe I'm bored with what I'm writing. I sort of need to take a break from it. It's not because, it's a snack that I'm just, munching on while the food is cooking.
Yeah, ultimately, I think most creative people just want to be free. And I think the novel allows you to be free. And what you think is a novel lets you free. You don't have those kind of conditions. For me, this just tells me that there's stuff to be put out there. There's stuff to be done that I have to kind of produce. So the short story for me has reined me in. And that is both a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. Because that earlier freedom that I think a longer form or just writing allows you the form, when you start thinking about the technical things, could mess with you. So you have to be very, very clear about how to balance that if you're starting out. Yeah.
All right, Jennifer, quickly, because we're out of time.
I would say that perhaps you shouldn't say that, yeah.
You shouldn't tell a sprinter to run a marathon, and you shouldn't tell a marathoner to run a sprinter, right? But they'll figure it out themselves.
Yeah. Short stories would eat you alive. Because you see, that puts it lower than the novel. And why should it be a stopgap? It's a proper form. It's like saying the poem is lesser than the novel. Poets would be so angry with you. It's the same with the short story. And for me, and perhaps some scholars say that the short story is the natural form, actually, that the novel is the studied form. The short story, rather the novel, is a bourgeois British form that came with colonization. But the short story was here. You know, it's older than the novel. But it's because we've become so pretentious about the novel that we are now looking down at the short story and say, oh, I go to the short story to learn my craft. Hell no. It is so rude.
Thank you. To amplify what Billy said, it's like asking a sprinter to do a marathon and a marathoner to do a sprint. They both have their uses. So that is the long and short of it. So thank you guys for being a wonderful audience. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Chika. Thank you, Billy. The books are out for sale. If you missed it, Chika's book.